Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the second weekend of June 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Established in 2019 by the Franklin News Foundation, the Center Square publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Today, we'll discuss the terror attack in Boulder, Colorado. We'll look at the ongoing budget debates, which has spilled over into a feud between President Trump and Elon Musk. And we'll hear about the Nippon-U.S. Steel merger. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the terror attack in Boulder, it's Sarah Roderick Fitch.
Today we are joined by Elise Appel, our Colorado reporter who has been following the Boulder, Colorado terror incident that happened last weekend on Sunday. Elise, welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Can you tell us a little bit about the case? What exactly transpired?
So on Sunday, Mohammed Solomon, a 45-year-old Egyptian national, actually arrived at the Pearl Street Mall in Boulder. There he ended up attacking a pro-Israel event, organized by a group called Run for Their Lives, which is an organization that just advocates, for the return of Israeli hostages by, demonstrating once a week. So the attack started at 1:26, and Solomon arrived with a flamethrower, multiple Molotov cocktails, over 12 Molotov cocktails. Ended up throwing some of those, setting people on fire. Law enforcement very quickly arrived on scene and arrested Solomon. He is currently in the Boulder County Jail on a $10 million bond. So we're awaiting charges against him.
So some of those charges, there's some hate crime charges. Those are federal. Is he facing federal charges as well?
Yes. So he's facing both federal and state charges. So some of the state charges are, obviously multiple counts of attempted murder, but he's also facing that federal charge it's called commission of a hate crime, which actually has a maximum sentence of life in prison. So the local law enforcement, state law enforcement, and federal law enforcement have all been working together to bring charges against Solomon.
Will there be terror charges too coming, or do we know about anything about that?
Yeah, so they've talked about it. The federal attorney general talked about possibly filing terrorism charges, but they haven't officially filed those yet. All they filed are the hate crime charges.
Yeah, because it was quickly deemed a terrorist attack. There was some in the media and then some on the left that were sort of slow to call it that. But the Attorney General, FBI Director Kash Patel was very quick to saying, "Hey, this was a terror attack." So it's kind of interesting to see if it's going to sort of move in that direction. And do we know? I know the investigation's still early on, but is there any word that there's maybe a coordinated effort or anything like that?
Yeah, no. So at this point, law enforcement is saying that there are no other suspects in the case. On that point, though, they have actually arrested, ICE has come in and actually arrested Solomon's family, as they were also here illegally. So we'll see how that goes forward. At this time, no charges, legal charges have actually been filed against his family. But they definitely, are looking at that, and just, they're looking to see if maybe they had any prior knowledge of the attack, which maybe then they would, press charges against the family. But at this point, they are in ICE custody. Law enforcement was very quick to say, though, that they do not think that there are any other suspects involved in the case. And, we're quick to assure the community that even though there's going to be, an enhanced, law enforcement presence in the community, they definitely don't think there are any other collaborators in the attack.
I think it's really interesting. One of the things about that, though, they're kind of quick to say, "Hey, there's no collaborators," but The fact that he was an Egyptian national, he's been in the country, I think a couple of years, correct?
Yep.
He overstayed a visa, which some people know, some people don't. Egypt is really kind of the epicenter of sort of this new Islamist movement, the jihadist movement, I guess you could say. It started with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Egyptian, which started in Egypt. So it's kind of interesting that he's an Egyptian national. So, it begs to question whether or not, especially since he's been here just 2 years, not exactly sure if we know when he entered the country. We know
2022. Yeah.
Okay, 2022. Just really interesting that it's just kind of that he came from there, and then also, that he does come from Egypt, whether or not there was some radicalization going on over there before he came over to the United States, or maybe if it happened over here. I know that he has said that he has no regrets, that he wanted to kill all the Zionists. So he's not really denying it at this point. And am I correct to say he said he was willing to die, right? I mean, he thought he was going to go down as a martyr, right?
Yeah, it was very clear that he was willing to die, but also that he was very willing to tell law enforcement that not only did he have no regrets, but that he would do it again if he was released. I do think it was really interesting with you mentioning Egypt, because just last night, President Trump signed that executive order restricting nationals, foreign nationals coming into the country. And what I thought was super interesting about that was that Egypt actually wasn't on the list, even though he specifically talked about this Boulder terrorism incident and talked about how many people are in the country, overstaying their visas. I thought it was so interesting that even though he specifically mentioned this incident, that Egypt actually wasn't on that list of restricted countries.
Yes, no, I thought that was really interesting too. And I mean, you kind of wonder, I mean, there's also been talk, I know Tom Homan, the border czar, has, since the whole border incident, since the Boulder incident happened, he has been warning of more terror attacks sort of imminent. And if this sort of has precipitated all that, is just, there's concern with people here. They don't know. They haven't been able to vet it. I know that Afghanistan was on that list. I know that once we pulled out of Afghanistan, and we accepted all these refugees and everything like that, I knew that the government had said, admitted that they really weren't able to vet them, and they lost track of, thousands of people. They just were checked in, and then, on some of these military bases, and then they just sort of left. So it's really interesting, to see, maybe this is all sort of, tying into, something that, maybe they're receiving or they're hearing on their end chatter, who knows? But it's certainly, troubling, I'd say the least. But, you were talking about the family. And so I know the White House had said, like it was Tuesday night, or the ICE and the White House said, hey, they were going to be, deported immediately. We don't really know too much about the family. I mean, he's 5 kids. One of them, I think, is grown that we know of. There's been some
in college, right?
Yes, college. She had like a scholarship. She had a scholarship. Is that correct?
I think so.
Do we know how that happened? If they weren't here legally, how I don't know. I mean, those are just some lingering questions, regarding, the family, and, yes, certainly what they knew. We don't know the ages of all the children. We just kind of know about one, and the wife. What did she know? And
I think that is law enforcement concern. I think that's law enforcement's concerns currently. That's ICE's concerns. And obviously they overstayed their visas. So that's also ICE's concern. But as of now, law enforcement has said that they, do not have any charges against the family, but they're definitely investigating that. Because Solomon himself said that he, had been, considering the attack for over a year. So it definitely was very premeditated, and it would be quite shocking if.
Yeah. That his wife, I'm not saying his children, but, his wife didn't maybe have some sort of inclination, and especially if he thought he was going to die, leaving his family, his wife and 5 children, to fend for themselves. If I'm correct, was he just like an Uber driver, or what?
Yeah, he was just an Uber driver.
Okay. So, I mean, he wasn't making probably very much money, imagine, especially with 5 kids and and living in the Denver area, I would say that's pretty, expensive. So yeah, I would imagine that, there would be something, but we don't know. I mean, that's obviously to come out, but I think it's really interesting. But thank you so much, Elise, for sharing that information with us. And we'll keep us updated and see where the case goes from here.
Thank you, Sarah and Elise. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the fight between President Trump and Elon Musk over the big, beautiful bill, let's now go to Dan McCaleb.
The U.S. Senate is beginning debate on President Donald Trump's one big, beautiful budget bill. But the conversation devolved Thursday into a social media storm of fury between the president and his once close ally, Elon Musk, who has criticized the package as government spending run amok. Trump didn't appreciate Musk's criticism, and the two went after each other on X, the social media site Musk owns, formerly known as Twitter. Joining me to discuss this is Therese Boudreau, congressional reporter for the Center Square. Therese, wow, that was quite the scene Thursday with the back and forth between the two. We are recording this Friday morning, so who knows what's going to happen today, but tell our listeners what happened yesterday.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Dan. So yesterday, Elon Musk, who has been relatively on the quieter side after taking a step back from Doge, tweeted that the one big beautiful bill is an abomination. He said, "I'm sorry, I can't stand it anymore. This massive, outrageous, pork-filled congressional spending bill is a disgusting abomination. Shame on those of you who vote for it." And so that was pretty out of the blue. Thomas Massie, who is a known fiscal watchdog, responded, "He's right." And so Trump did not take too kindly to that. And Trump tweeted out a response essentially questioning why the federal government has so many contracts with Tesla and suggesting that maybe the federal government should end those contracts, which would help save money and would help in turn fund the one big beautiful bill. And then they kind of just escalated from there. Musk retweeted a tweet calling for Trump's impeachment. And it's all just been a very, very dramatic.
Yeah, very, very dramatic to say the least. Musk also made some sort of unsubstantiated claims that Trump is in the Jeffrey Epstein files. Jeffrey Epstein was the man who was charged with sex trafficking, who authorities say committed suicide in prison in 2019, although there's all kinds of conspiracy theories about that. So it got personal, really. And these are two men who, just couple of weeks ago were best buds. And as we said, Trump, of course, supports the one big beautiful bill, which he's trying to navigate through the Senate after it narrowly passed the U.S. House a couple of weeks ago. He gets defensive a lot of times from criticism, doesn't take it kindly, and Musk's X tirade yesterday certainly didn't help matters. There is reports this morning that they are going to try and talk today. But Therese, you've been covering the one big beautiful bill, the so-called one big beautiful bill in Congress as the House had several hearings on it, and ultimately passed it over to the Senate. How does this back and forth affect the bill? There are certainly some Republican U.S. senators who are skeptical of the bill as well, saying it spends too much money. What's next?
Well, that's a difficult question, asking what's next, but right now it's in the Senate's ballpark. So the House, they, again, very narrowly passed, by a margin of one vote, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It's also known as the Budget Reconciliation Bill. And it does quite a lot of things. It's essentially a massive policy bill that codifies, the House version extends for 10 years, the 2017 Trump tax cuts. It raises the debt ceiling by $4 trillion, adds work requirements to Medicaid and SNAP. And it's extremely costly. It's in the multi-trillions, although budget organizations will debate whether different offsets that lawmakers found in savings in the bill, how much those will take off the cost. But House Speaker Mike Johnson, he made some very delicate deals, within different factions of his own party. So there were some Republicans in the House who said they wouldn't vote for it unless the state and local tax deduction was raised, or SALT taxes, that deduction was raised. There were others who wanted more, the Inflation Reduction Act was partially repealed, and so some wanted more of it repealed. So he had this very delicate balance where he fulfilled just enough of members' requirements to get it through the House. But now the Senate, they have their own wish list items. For one thing, none of the Republican senators, I should say, care about SALT. And if they strip that from the package, that gives them more money to spend on other priorities, like permanently extending different business tax cuts. One of the major things in that bill is the use of baselines, or basically the way that lawmakers score the cost of it. So the House operated under the traditional current law baseline, which basically just means they assume that extending the Trump tax cuts for the next 10 years is going to cost at least $4 trillion, because that's about $4 trillion in lost revenue. But the Senate, a lot of Republicans in the Senate want to permanently extend the tax cuts. And this is where another huge debate has been going on. And there's actually been relative silence on Thune's part as they're going through other things. He said that he wants to use the current policy baseline, but that still hasn't been officially announced yet. Essentially, current policy baseline would be the senators saying, okay, these tax cuts have been current policy since 2017, so extending them wouldn't add anything to the debt. It wouldn't cost anything. It'd just be a continuation of current policy. And if they do that, that theoretically subtracts trillions off the bill and makes it a lot more affordable looking. And then it also means, well, you can extend the tax cuts forever if it has no fiscal impact. So a lot of budget organizations have been sounding the alarm on this. They say, no, this is just a gimmick.
Thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all things budget reconciliation and Musk-Trump feud at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Therese. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the Nippon-U.S. Steel merger, let's go to Christina Lingell.
With me today is our Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, there's finally been some big movement on the Nippon and U.S. Steel deal. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening and what's happening next?
Yeah, over the last week, we've had a huge development in the sense that Donald Trump has changed his mind since he was on the campaign trail, and he believes that U.S. Steel's new partnership, as he calls it, with Nippon Steel, which is based in Japan, that this is the best way forward for America. He has put his stamp of approval on it, meaning that the government will no longer block the sale as they did under the Biden administration. What that means practically is multi-billion-dollar investments in steel mills in southwestern Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, $5,000 bonuses for workers, and most importantly for people, the assurance that U.S. Steel will remain a Pennsylvania company. It'll stay headquartered in Pittsburgh. And then that threat and that fear that it wasn't going to is gone now. So it was a very celebratory day Friday when President Trump went to West Mifflin, Pennsylvania to celebrate this at one of their plants. And there was a very interesting group of people there. You had obviously the president, many Republican congressional lawmakers, you had state lawmakers, you had a lot of steel workers there too, who were, you would think of all people, the most worried about perhaps losing their jobs to non-unionized states or some of the other concerns that had been brought up over the deal in the past. They were just thrilled that U.S. Steel was staying put and that Nippon was willing to invest in them to bring them into the future to meet certain climate action goals and things like that are really making it hard to succeed in the steel industry right now.
And what have you heard from outside of those leaders who are there to celebrate? What have other people who have, had a significant stake in this conversation said about the deal?
There's still a lot of skepticism. Certainly the United Steelworkers Union, their leadership at the international level and up has been very vocal against this deal because they've been concerned all along that Nippon wouldn't hold up to their end of the bargain and that they would close down facilities in Pennsylvania and that they would just move operations south to avoid collective bargaining agreements. There is a U.S. Steel plant in Arkansas that we actually lost because of slow permitting in Pennsylvania, and particularly in Allegheny County. So that was that job or that project, and 900 jobs that were six-figure jobs were moved to Arkansas. And so Pennsylvania really doesn't want to see that again. The United Steelworkers Union thought that was going to happen if if Nippon was allowed in. They wanted U.S. Steel to remain domestically owned and operated. There was a domestic bidder who came in a few months before Nippon and offered to buy U.S. Steel for about half the price. That was Cleveland-Cliffs in Ohio. But critics of that deal said that, Cleveland-Cliffs couldn't afford to invest in U.S. Steel in the way that they needed to upgrade their facilities and to keep their jobs here. But also, Cleveland-Cliffs itself has other steel mills that they've had to reduce jobs on and production because of tariffs and all these other things that are happening, economically speaking. So they're not, as of this new deal, which has been said to increase investments from Nippon, although it's not entirely clear how much and what, but increase nonetheless. They still haven't changed their mind. They don't think that it's any better than it was 6 months ago when Biden blocked it. And they're not convinced that it was the right deal for workers.
And for national security. So that was another one of the discussions that people had. I know the president said no more shoddy steel from Shanghai. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So how is it looking for the national security picture? That was one of the concerns.
So yes, no more shoddy steel from Shanghai, which you know how he loves his alliteration. So that was another Trumpism for sure. But the concern all along, and this is one that Biden shared, was that if we were to let an international competitor take U.S. Steel over, that would continue to elevate the unfair trade practices that are happening on the foreign steel market. Namely, that China is flooding the market with really cheap, inferior product, which drives the price of U.S. steel up and makes it a commodity that no one wants to buy, and further, leading to its decline. So also, there was concern about having one of our biggest international competitors, economically speaking, being not the sole producer, but a main producer of things like steel and aluminum and all these products that are really vital to providing national defense in America. So Biden didn't want Nippon, which is a Japanese company to be sure, not Chinese. He didn't want them to take over because he felt that this would make the problem worse, not better. And Trump was kind of on that same page, but also he didn't like the idea of U.S. Steel not being U.S. Steel. He thought that merging with Nippon would it would lose its domestic ownership, and it would feel it would go very much against his desired policy of America first and making America great again, to give up one of our historical steel manufacturing companies to Nippon. So what's happened here is that Trump is saying that because it's now a partnership, which again, not entirely sure what that definition is, but it's going to be as American as it can be, is how it's been described to me, in that, Americans will stay on the board and have majority control, but that Nippon will make the investments and therefore benefit from those investments in the company. And because of those boosted investments, it's actually going to be better for the workers there. It's going to save jobs. It's going to create more jobs down the line. So that's where his turn has been. He's saying from a national security perspective, this makes it so that U.S. Steel does stay in Pennsylvania, does stay in America. The production here is increased and the value is increased, and it's actually going to hurt China's chances of undercutting our products, not making it, not emboldening them to say.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves with the new merger in place. Thank you, Kristen. We'll be following this story and more at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.
Thanks to Christina and Kristen. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Did the Washington State Attorney General help the Perkins Coie law firm sue the Trump administration? Is antitrust activities or lack of government investment to blame for the growing cost of college tuition? And do top CEOs merit $1 million salaries? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting that you may have missed at centersquare.com. Florida and Texas have gained the most by interstate migration, while California, Illinois, and New York have lost the most. That's according to a new analysis. The National Taxpayers Union Foundation report revealed that California, New York, Illinois, and other states with high tax burdens continue to hemorrhage taxpayers and tax revenue, while Florida remains the undeniable winner from the movement of taxpayers and their dollars from state to state. The report notes that in the last decade, New York lost $111 billion in net adjusted gross income. California lost $102 billion, and Illinois lost $63 billion to interstate migration. Florida, on the other hand, gained $196 billion, and Texas gained $54 billion. Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose is sending evidence of voter fraud to Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost and attorneys general in 7 other states for prosecution. LaRose announced Tuesday that he found potential fraud in non-citizen registration and double votes in Ohio, Virginia, Arizona, Colorado, Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. The accusations came during ongoing reviews of the Ohio State Registration Database with state and federal information. He said he found evidence of 30 non-citizen registrations in Ohio and 11 people who voted in Ohio who also voted in the other 7 states and Washington, D.C. Virginia Attorney General Jason Miyares has referred Loudoun County Public Schools and the Loudoun County School Board to the U.S. Departments of Education and Justice. Miyares' office found the school launched an investigation into 3 boys who objected to sharing a locker room with a biological female at Stonebridge High School. The Attorney General says its investigation revealed, quote, a disturbing misuse of authority by Loudoun County Public Schools, where students appear to have been targeted not for misconduct, but for expressing their discomfort for being forced to share a locker room with a member of the opposite sex, end quote. A new amicus brief argues that the overturning of Wisconsin's Act 10 was judicial overreach and took power over Wisconsin's budget away from the legislature. The Ohio-based Buckeye Institute argued that a Wisconsin Circuit Court's decision to overturn Act 10 interrupts the balance between the legislative and judicial branches. Signed into law in 2011 by then Governor Scott Walker, Act 10 limited most public sector union contract negotiations to salaries only and capped those salary increases to the rate of inflation. The legislation was challenged and overturned in a ruling by Dane County Court Judge Jacob Frost in December. The California Assembly voted against a measure that would have prevented the state's new low-carbon fuel standard from going into effect. Many say the standard will add 65 cents to the cost per gallon of gas if implemented as planned in July. The rule requires producers of fuels that release more carbon than a tightening standard to purchase credits from producers of fuels that release less carbon than the standard. This rule would also impact the parts of Nevada and Arizona that rely on California refineries. The GOP proposed measure to overturn the standards, part of the caucus's Cost of Living Week, failed largely along party lines. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the Perkins Coie Law Firm's relationship with the Washington State Attorney General, let's now go to Spencer Pauly.
I'm here today with TJ Martinell, and we're talking about a recent story of his showing emails between Seattle-based private law firm Perkins Coie and the Washington State Attorney General's office, collaborating on an amicus brief filed against the Trump administration. Now, TJ, why don't we just start off here? If you can just walk us through the timeline of the communications between Perkins Coie and Attorney General Nick Brown's office.
Yeah, so what happened is Trump filed he signed these executive orders canceling contracts with Perkins Coie and also revoking their security clearance. Perkins Coie filed a lawsuit on March 11th, and the Attorney General's office filed an amicus brief or friend of the court brief on the 12th, so the day after. Mm-hmm. Emails show that they were in communication days before this, effectively collaborating on both the lawsuit and the amicus brief. So the Solicitor General for Washington State, Noah Purcell, was asking them for feedback on when were they going to file, what are some of the claims they're going to make, what should they include in the amicus brief. You had an attorney with, I believe it was a Deputy Solicitor General, who was giving advice to Perkins Coie on when to file and where to file to ensure that they won their court case. And I think the question people are going to be asking themselves is, why does this matter? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. One is, at the time of this communication, they had 10 active contracts with Perkins Coie, which they failed to disclose in their amicus brief. Mm-hmm. These contracts effectively make Perkins Coie their attorney in 10 different instances. So you have a Washington Deputy Solicitor General giving legal advice to their attorney but not in the context of their actual attorney-client relationship. They also didn't disclose these communications or the extent to which they had collaborated with the court, right? And so the idea of an amicus brief is you're effectively acting as a neutral third party who doesn't have a direct involvement in the lawsuit, right? I think the other thing is that's important for people who are not familiar with law to understand is that all these, or not all of them, but most of these communications had the subject line common interest privileged. And that's something the attorneys put in there. And the reason that matters is because they were trying to get these communications exempt entirely from a public records request. So this meant when the request was initially filed for these emails, the Public Records Office claimed this exemption in which if you got the emails back, they would be completely blacked over. So you wouldn't even know who sent what. You wouldn't even know who sent the email and who it was sent to. And they finally turned those over after a lawsuit was threatened with the Public Records Office because this exemption doesn't apply. Because the reason why is if it were true, if it was common interest privilege, that's effectively an extension of the attorney-client privilege. Mm-hmm. Except the Washington State Attorney General is not acting as a client or an attorney for Perkins Coie in this lawsuit. They're acting as a third party that's not directly involved, which is why the records were turned over, because if that were to be upheld, it would be effectively the Attorney General's office admitting, contradicting their own claims in their own amicus brief about their relationship with the law firm.
And so you talked to Pete Serrano. He's the former GOP Attorney General candidate who I believe lost to Brown in the last election. Now, what kind of was he saying the same thing you're saying right now, these concerns about maybe the ethical implications of this collaboration between Perkins Coie and the AGO's office?
Yeah, he also weighed in on other things. One, this is the use of taxpayer dollars to defend private law firms' access to federal taxpayer dollars. So the question is, how is this in the interest of Washington state residents? Because he's not defending Washington state law. He's not even defending any constitutional provision. The Washington State Attorney General's office is suing to ensure that Perkins Coie has effectively to force the federal government to use Perkins Coie as their attorney. So effectively, you don't have a right to not hire these people. It's basically what they're doing. And so and also the Solicitor General, Noah Purcell, he's a former Perkins Coie attorney. So you have former attorneys for the law firm using their public office and resources to help their former employer gain financially. That's effectively what Pete Serrano was pointing out, is that he's with the Silent Majority Foundation. He's not going to get this kind of advice or assistance from the Attorney General's office.
Right. So I see what you're saying. But you ruffled some feathers here, I guess, when it comes to the Attorney General's office here, based on what I was reading. This is particularly comments you got back from the AGO's Deputy Communications Director. Now, he said he dismissed the idea of ethical concern, calling them what I think absurd fiction. And I would like how do you respond to this stance that their communications with Perkins Coie were routine and appropriate?
Mike Falk, who's the Deputy Communications Director, responded. He is the only person I talked to, and I reached out to many people, many attorneys, many legal sources, many legal ethical experts around the nation in Washington State. He's the only person, and he's also not licensed to practice law. He's a communications guy. He's the only person to have said that this is fine.
Well, I look forward to seeing what happens next, TJ, and thanks for talking to us about this.
Thank you, Spencer and TJ. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug, with more on a House hearing on antitrust activities among Ivy League colleges. Let's now go to Eliana Cardodal.
Today we'll be talking about college affordability. The House held a hearing this week discussing the topic and in particular, antitrust concerns surrounding the Ivy League. Joining me to dig into this is Andrew Rice, a reporter for the Center Square. Andrew, what are the antitrust concerns that representatives and witnesses in this hearing raised?
Right. Well, hello, Eliana. The concerns raised by many of the witnesses and representatives on this committee were really focused on antitrust issues and the breaking of antitrust laws by elite universities, specifically Ivy League universities. So representatives brought up issues such as low class admission rates at many high tier Ivy League universities, such as Brown, Harvard, Princeton, and others, as well as the collusion to target more wealthy students so that they could bring them in for admissions practices. There was also a big concern raised by witnesses and representatives about an administrative bloat in many of these institutions. For example, Representative Scott Fitzgerald said in the hearing, he's a Republican from Wisconsin, said, ever since Ivy League was established in the 1950s, the schools were focused on exclusivity, maximizing profits, and artificially inflated prestige. One witness on the committee hearing, his name was Scott Martin. He's a partner at a Washington, D.C. based law firm called Hausfeld, pointing to several signs of antitrust concerns. He said these concerns were embedded in the structure of Ivy League institutions. These included the Ivy League's nonprofit status, their high endowment rates, and, like previously mentioned, limited acceptance rates, all pointed to a fundamental disregard of antitrust legislation.
And I know some people also mentioned concerns about the lack of transparency in pricing and how we don't really know how they're setting the cost for any given student. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Right, exactly. Well, that has been the central focus point of a lot of legal issues and challenges brought by former students of Ivy League institutions. And that was also a topic of conversation brought up in this committee hearing. Representative Fitzgerald brought up that there were students back in 2022, a group of former students sued several Ivy League organizations because of a collusion to use financial service calculators and the resources that many of these institutions had to target wealthy families and individuals to find out exactly how much they could pay for college, how much they could afford, and charge them that exact amount.
And you mentioned kind of the concerns around bloat in the universities, and one of the witnesses, specifically a student from Brown, that was one of his kind of main concerns. Can you tell us a little about his testimony?
Right, exactly. So one of the witnesses, a student, Alex Shea, he's a rising junior at Brown University. He was also a journalist for the Brown Spectator. He back in March, sent Doge-like emails to the administrative staff at Brown University asking what they had done for their jobs in the previous week. He was concerned that the administrative staff, the non-teaching faculty, far outnumbered any reasonable ratio in his mind to the actual undergrad population. He said these were the main reasons why Brown would be charging almost $93,000 in tuition per year for this academic year, as well as, while charging that much, also being expected to run a $46 million deficit in their costs. So, and that deficit is from things that money that they cannot track, and money that they're losing out on in what they're spending. He said he was really concerned about this. And when he brought these concerns in an investigation through his Doge style emails, he was met with an investigation from the administration. Charges were quickly dropped after that investigation, but he was investigated for harassment by administration officials.
And on the other side of this hearing, many members pointed to other things that would influence college affordability that they believe are more pressing than just antitrust in the Ivy League. What were some of the other concerns raised by other members?
Right. Well, many Democrat members of the commission and even one of the witnesses before the committee were more concerned about prices of not Ivy League institutions, but rather prices for state and community college educational institutions. So they brought up more of those concerns, and specifically they were concerned about the cuts to many federal student aid programs brought about by the One Big Beautiful Bill that was just passed in the House several weeks ago. And is still in the Senate for appropriations. There have been lots of concerns that there were cut and limits to Pell Grants, limiting Pell Grants for students that are not full time. So Pell Grants students that are not full time cannot receive Pell Grants any longer. And then also limiting the eligibility for general student loans, as well as how much a student can take out in loans for a particular time to complete a degree. There's also some stipulations that colleges have to invest in those student loans if they go into default. So that was a big concern brought up.
Well, Andrew, thank you for your insights on this story. It's definitely a complicated topic. I'm sure we will continue to follow those, and anyone can keep up with that at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Andrew. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss CEO salaries, it's Dr. Orphe Divounguy. So you called out this story from the Wall Street Journal, which talks about Rick Smith, who is the CEO of Axon Enterprise, and the headline on the story is "Taser Boss tops ranking of highest paid CEOs with $165 million." Here's the list: Rick Smith, Axon, $165 million. I'm rounding up. It was only $164.53 million. Lawrence Culp Jr. from General Electric, which has made it quite the comeback, $88.95 million. Steven Schwartzman from Blackstone, $84.03 million. And Tim Cook, $74.61. Of course, he's the CEO of Apple. And if you take a look at it, you can see sort of what their pay was versus the year before, and then what they returned versus the industry. In a graphic form. And I think it's interesting conversation. There's 417 CEOs that are on this list. They're not all, paid like Rick Smith or the other guys that are on the top. But whenever a list like this comes out, the question is, does the CEO earn or merit that kind of pay? And I think that's at the heart of why you wanted to talk about this.
Well, I mean, look, again, as an economist, this is a fascinating topic. And so, of course, the initial reaction for most people is, wow, no one deserves that kind of pay. Well, they don't that's crazy, right? Sometimes my reaction is like, whoa, I should be getting paid a whole lot more than I'm getting paid, right? And here's the reality. Nick Bloom, you've heard of Nick Bloom, I'm sure, in the conversation about, work from home. He's kind of owned that debate for more than a decade now. It's done a ton of research. Nick Bloom also did some research on coming up with the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. Really, really, really talented economist. Well, he's the co-author of a paper that basically tells you that, look, actually, the firms that are highly productive, right? Or, where the firm productivity is actually linked to higher pay for their highest paid employee, likely the CEO, right? The gap is huge for those highly performing companies. And the way they measure performance in their paper is basically revenue per employee. So these CEOs actually pull their weight in terms of revenue per employee. Like how much revenue are they able to bring in relative to the inputs, which are the number of employees they're bringing in. And ultimately it translates to higher profitability for shareholders. And that's why they get paid so much money.
Yeah. At the lower, by the way, that list is really fascinating. I mean, and it lists, I don't know, exactly why it's 417, but that is a breakout of the S&P 500's CEOs. Mark Zuckerberg was number 63. JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon, who, always has something cheery to say. He came in at number 23.
Just for our audience, what do you mean by cheery?
I'm being sarcastic.
What do you mean by cheery?
I think he always say, it's like, you got to respect the man. And I mean, obviously he's built a terrific company at Chase, but it's like always, I just always feel like, if he hadn't gotten that job, he might have been one of those doomsayers that has the YouTube channel.
Yeah. I think he really wants to keep, people on their toes.
I you know what? Hey, look, like, I think part of this conversation is like, what does the CEO do that merits that kind of pay? And somebody like Jamie Dimon, I mean, to be able to hold on to that role at Chase, massive bank, for as long as he has,
with a ton of talented employees. I mean,
100%. But then, but where do the talent why does he have talented employees?
That's
because he's a talented leader. I mean, and if you don't have talented employees, and you have employees, you're probably not a great leader. You're probably not a great CEO. So, I mean, in this conversation, I think it's like, there's always how can that one person, in the organization, merit that kind of pay? Well, I mean, they bring value at an extraordinary level. I mean, I don't have right in front of me what, Axon's, total revenue was, but its 1 year return, was 130%. I mean, it's pretty good. Right. I mean, it's pretty good. You doubled the previous year's results, and then, let's throw another 30% up on top of that.
Let me give you the numbers from the paper. A doubling in firm productivity is associated with 11% more pay for the CEO compared to 4.7% more higher pay for the median worker. Right. So you see, basically, workers do get an increase, but nowhere near, the increase, right? The CEO is more than double, right? More than double, based on the doubling, as the impact of doubling productivity. And so, yeah, I mean, that's where the gap comes from. So yes, employees navigate towards more productive firms. They also contribute to the firm becoming even more productive. But CEOs essentially, great management is important. Having really good managers. I mean, you hear all the time people leave because of leave companies because of bad managers, right? And so if you want to keep the best, if you want to attract the best talent and you want to keep the best talent, you have to be a pretty talented manager.
I appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Kruger on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.